Hello and welcome. With this video, I respond to one of the most notable questions related to the history of the Second World War. Why did Adolf Hitler hate the Jews? Adolf Hitler is known for having committed some of the worst crimes ever. To explain his hate against Jews, we will start by saying that during the First World War, Hitler was a soldier who experienced the violence of this armed conflict. After Germany was defeated, he dedicated himself to political activism, meeting in groups that discussed the policies at that time, and discovered that he was a good speaker. Well, he knew how to capture the public attention, and little by little, Hitler became very popular. The problem was that his ideas were based on hatred towards various groups of people, disdain for democracy, and the justification of violence to achieve its ends. However, he got quite popular. He formed a political party, the Nazi Party, and in 1933 he became Chancellor of Germany, the highest office of that country. Soon, the Nazi Party was the only one allowed, and it stayed in power indefinitely. Ultimately, his aggressive policy helped Europe plunge to war again from 1939 to 1945, the year the Soviet army surrounded and took Berlin and when Hitler committed suicide. To all this, the question persists. What made Hitler hate the Jews so that he planned and took into action the killing of more than 6 million of them? To answer this, you have to go back a few centuries. The Jews have had to adapt to adverse conditions to survive and get ahead. Its traditional territory, Israel, was invaded by foreign powers throughout the centuries: Babylonians, Egyptians, Romans, Arabs, Crusaders, Turks, the British, and others. Therefore, Jews had to adapt to live in countries where most people professed a different religion. So that's why the laws were generally uneven against them. And in the early 20th century, in Europe, the Jews had many disadvantages. However, as a strength, Jews were a united community. Their children learned to read very well from a very young age, so they tend to excel in what they do. Some of the most outstanding human beings in music, arts, film, science, businesses, politics, philosophy, literature, and more have been of Jewish descent. So, if they are so outstanding, why did Hitler hate them so much? We can mention 3 reasons. First, the resentment towards Jews was widespread in Europe and various parts of the world. The rational approach from the Enlightenment was still struggling to end with certain concepts that originated in the Middle Ages. Back in those days, when the feudal lords needed money, they sometimes accused the Jews of being demon worshippers and stole whatever they had. During an economic crisis, for example, it was also quite common that the king or the rulers spread the rumor that the Jews had conspired to steal the goods of the population. The result used to be that the people, angry, went after them violently and took out their anger against the Jews, not against the rulers. Even at the end of the 19th century, this practice, known as pogrom in Poland, Ukraine, and some parts of the Russian Empire, were common. Therefore, at the end of the First World War and during the economic crisis that followed, the same sentiments against the Jews started to emerge in some parts of the world. Millions of Germans suffered from this crisis, while Jews, accustomed to overcoming adversity, adapted, got jobs, and even owned successful companies. So the specter of hatred toward Jews began to revive when Adolf Hitler emerged as a popular figure. The second point that we have to take into consideration to understand why Hitler hated the Jews is his own history. Hitler experienced rejection throughout his life. Before becoming the leader of Nazi Germany, he did not profess any noticeable affection for his family, partner, or any group of friends in particular. Hitler barely entered an art school, and his paintings got criticized for being unartistic. He was rejected from the Austrian army because of his stature, but the German army, much more needed of soldiers, accepted him. Psychologists who have studied Hitler's biography agree that his personality matches the traits of someone who deep down feels small, inferior, weak, and vulnerable. So, to compensate for these feelings of inferiority, Hitler fed the idea that there were people weaker than him: homosexuals, gypsies, the mentally ill, and those who, according to it, were degenerates. Thus, little by little, Hitler became a big bully, wandering the streets of the German cities, speaking against the undesirables. However, the ones he hated the most were the Jews, because it bothered him greatly that during the crisis of the 20s, some of them were not doing that bad, while he was a nobody, an average poor citizen. So in that period, he fed the belief that the Jews were taking advantage of the Germans with all kinds of lies. For example, that they didn't fight in the war, that they controlled the newspapers, that there was an international conspiracy of Jews to take over the world's money and with it the entire planet, which is ridiculously false. Now, let's get into the third and final point of why Hitler hated the Jews. Since the beginning of his political career, he realized that he had to sympathize with the bulk of the German people. Eager to fit into the German society, downgrading what he considered to be non-German, he also went to exalt all that was German and did this to such a degree that convinced millions of people that the Germans were not only disciplined, hard-working, and good-spirited people, but he proclaimed the idea that they were a superior race, genetically speaking, and that if they had lost the First World War, it was because their neighboring countries had realized that they had to stop the Germans. Behind this theory, the belief that the Jews were the main conspirators against the superiority of the Germans was a key element. Also, communism, according to Hitler, was an invention of the Jews to control the world. Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Leon Trotsky, prominent communists, had Jewish origins. With this idea, he gained much popularity among members of the government and the owners of the industries in Germany because they were very much afraid of a communist revolution. Therefore, the Nazis led millions into thinking that the communists and the Jews shared a common purpose against Germany. With this pretext, he not only imprisoned and killed so many innocent people, but he invaded the Soviet Union. The biggest clash in World War II was the one between the Nazis and the Soviets. 80% of the casualties of the German armed forces were against the Soviets, and the Soviets lost almost 20 million human lives in this conflict against the Nazis. Finally, let's close the topic by recalling that Hitler's ideas were successful in Germany because many Germans felt like him, vulnerable, deceived by the rulers, and robbed by everyone else. But raising the spirit of the German people with the idea that they were a superior race had terrible consequences. Under this doctrine, the Nazis pretended to justify the extermination of gypsies, homosexuals, communists, political opponents, the mentally unfitted, and of course, the Jews. Hitler ordered to kill all the Jews in the greatest secrecy possible, so it is still unknown exactly how many human lives were taken away by the Nazis. For all this, we must be very careful of who we grant the power to govern, especially if what they try to do is use hatred to give themselves power. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you for watching. See you next time.